makes you think that everything must come now. But the struggle in which you're involved in is the struggle in which you will not reap that which you've sown. You have already reaped that which has been sown by past generations. You must sow for future generations to reap. I'm so tired of brothers and sisters coming and saying, when are we going to enjoy the good life? It ain't for you, it's for the next generation. Do your work now for the next generation. When you work for your people, it is not what you receive, it's what you give. And the best thing about working for the people is that what you really give for the people, sometimes nobody else knows except you. This is real struggle for the people. This is real struggle for the people. Thus, we must wipe out from our minds that the struggle in which we're involved in is going to give us any victories. The struggle in which we're involved in is an eternal struggle. We are not working for ourselves. We are working for generations to come. Therefore, what I've done, you ain't even begin to see. Generations later will come to thank us for the work we've done now.
Así es. Warmest greetings, sisters and brothers, and welcome to the Pan-African People's Phone-In. The Pan-African People's Phone-In is a space for themed, interactive discussions in cyberspace. So it's over the airwaves in that sense, but it's in cyberspace. The issues really are workshop-themed issues relevant to African people, both from a historical perspective, a contemporary perspective, and as we move forward, it will be a future perspective also. The Pan-African People's Phone-In will, from time to time, invite revolutionary Pan-Africanist guests. At the moment, the format that we're working with is not a guest-orientated format, but when we do develop in that direction, there will occasionally be non-African guests as well. And all guests will be invited to make their contributions on the basis or on themes which are relevant to African people. The second half of the program will then set the scene for a more general discussion where people will be invited to ring in and contribute. But in the workshop format that we're using now, people are free to ring in at any point during the time that I'm actually going through the literature that we're discussing. So I ask sisters and brothers to please spread the word. Tell all of your family, friends, fellow organisation members, colleagues, associates and other networks about the show. Message to your friends right now. Let them know that the program is happening. Encourage them to listen. Every Monday, that's every Monday evening, from 8 p.m. until 10 p.m. I want to open by just saying welcome. I'm wishing a welcome to all of the people associated with the Pan-African People's Phone-In. That includes, of course, all of the listeners and all of the aspiring listeners. Welcome to all of you. I want to wish a good evening also to the station's engineers, the engineers who are hard at work in the background, making sure that the actual program runs smoothly. A warm good evening to you, the station's engineers. Of course, I want to welcome and say good evening to the station's management. That they are in the background providing the whole of this infrastructure so that this facility is available to our community as a means of education, communication, and part of the community building process. So, warm good evening to the station's management. And of course, I want to wish a warm good evening to my fellow presenters here on Bless Radio. I want to, there are too many for me to go through, but of course I always want to wish Our Lady Leo a warm good evening. Brilliant sister, absolutely brilliant sister, who you will find here on Bless Radio on a Friday evening between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. I want to also wish our brother Dougie, a stalwart in our community, a warm good evening. You'll find brother Dougie here in the period. Just bear with me, sisters and brothers, whilst we just sort out minor issues in the background. So we wish our brother Dougie a warm good evening. Also, you find brother Dougie here on Bless Radio on a Thursday evening, generally between the hours of about 6 p.m. To about 10 p.m. You'll find our brother sharing very important community information during that slot. Of course, there are others. There are many others. I can't go for everybody. I'm thinking of brother Jegna at the moment also, who shares information on a Sunday. But there are too many for me to actually go through. So I'm saying a warm good evening to all of my fellow presenters here on Bless Radio. Now, let me just give the number. I give out the number at the top of the program so that people have an opportunity to note it should they choose to. And that will facilitate them ringing in and participating in the program if at some point they feel they want to contribute. So the number for interaction in this evening's program, it's the studio number. So it's the number you should be able to ring in on any time here at Bless Radio. The number for interaction is 079 444 313 66. Now I'm asking sisters and brothers, if you haven't got a pen handy, please go look for one, get a pen, get some paper, or just get whatever medium you use to make your records, really, to record information. And if it's pen and paper, I just ask that you you write this down so that the number for interaction is at your fingertips and available to you if you decide you want to interact. So the number for interaction once more is 079 444 313 66. So today, in today's topic, let me just say, for over a month now, we have been looking at the strategy of Marcus Garvey. We've been working from the book, actually, the book Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy, subtitled An Outlook on Liberation. So we've been working from that book. We've looked at chapter 1, which was an introduction to Pan-Africanism. In fact, even before chapter 1, we looked at the vision. I shared a vision for the future of Africa. So we looked at the vision for Africa. Then we looked at chapter 1, which was an overview, an introduction to Pan-Africanism. And for over a month prior to today, we've been looking at Marcus Garvey, the strategy of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. And we brought that to its conclusion in last week's program. So this week we move on. We hand the baton on from Garvey to the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. This week we begin the strategy of Nkrumah. So we looked at the strategy of Garvey. We're going to look at the strategy of Nkrumah this week, and maybe in the next week, and maybe even the week beyond that. And then after that, we are going to look at the strategy of Malcolm X. And the reason for doing that is that when you look at the strategies of these great giants, these giants of Pan-Africanism, when you look at their strategies and you examine the commonalities, the common themes in their strategies, you begin to see a correct way forward for Pan-Africanism. So we're taking ourselves out of the confusion by looking at the strategies of these greats, of these giants, to help us to now plan in the current day, in our current circumstances, but pulling into our plans the themes of these giants to help us to actually move forward. Now, so the strategy of Nkrumah is chapter 3 of the book Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy, subtitled An Outlook on Liberation. So it's actually chapter 3 of that book, and so we'll be starting that today. But before we go into the Libation Corner, what I'm going to do is just give an overview of that book. I think there's a camera, so I'll just hold the book up to the camera. I think there's a camera somewhere over there, and there may be another camera somewhere over there. So I'm just pointing the book in the general direction of the cameras, just in case sisters and brothers actually have an interest in getting hold of a copy. Now, let me say this, actually, that the learning process is enhanced by having a copy of the book. And not only having a copy, but reading the book in between the programs. So if you have a copy of the book, you should be reading the strategy of Nkrumah. You should be reading chapter 3 in the knowledge that that's what we're going to discuss in the program. And so if you get a copy between now and next week, you should be reading chapter 3, so that when we come to discuss it on air next week, you're already familiar with the contents and can make powerful and intelligent contributions to the discussion. Now, I'm not sure if somebody was ringing in. If you were ringing in, please feel free to ring again. It does look as though somebody may have been ringing in. I apologise. It's my own fault for getting carried away and not being so observant. But if you were ringing in, please feel free to ring in again, and I'll be happy to include you in the program. So this is the overview of the book, and in fact, the overview is just on the back of the book for anybody who is interested. And it reads as follows: Pan-Africanism from Program to Philosophy is the only book in the world to provide clear, lucid, and simple explanations of the liberation strategies of Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Malcolm X. Historians have been naturally concerned with reporting the facts of the lives of these great Pan-Africanists, but it is for activists to contextualize them in liberation strategies and action plans, a process kick-started in this book. In addition, 1. It provides a clear and succinct explanation of international capitalism's parasitical dependence upon African people. 2. It provides a clear, simple explanation of scientific socialism, relating it to African principles and culture. 3. It introduces the notion of the greater cycle of revolution, which examines and locates revolution not as an incident, but as a process in the context of the entirety of human history. 4. Through an examination of universal principles, it locates the material base of the two opposing sets of ideologies driving human activity and identifies the natural position of African culture in that milieu. And finally, 5. Through a newly devised set of dialectical tools, it provides a powerfully clear philosophical analysis of matter as a basis for uncovering and understanding the universal laws required for Africa's liberation. Pan-Africanism, from program to philosophy, is a long overdue, much needed sourcebook on the theory of Pan-Africanism. For people new to Pan-Africanist activity, or those who simply want to understand what Pan-Africanism is, this book provides clear theoretical guidance. For seasoned cadres and veterans of the Pan-Africanist movement, it is a checkpoint, a frame of reference for assessing, orientating, and even refocusing the trajectory of their activities. Ideally, it should be studied collectively in groups, particularly those genuinely working towards the liberation of Africa and her people in the context of worldwide revolution. So that is an overview of the book. And I think right now what we'll do is we will move into the libation corner. So this is the libation corner. This is the section of the program where we honor our ancestors. Now you can contribute to the libation corner in one of three ways. Firstly, if you have a loved one that has recently passed, we ask you to ring in and have that loved one introduced here in the libation corner. Secondly, if it is the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, then again, you're most welcome to ring in and have your loved one acknowledged here in the libation corner. And thirdly, if there's an African historical anniversary that all of us should be remembering at this time, then once again we invite you to ring in and have that African historical anniversary acknowledged right here in the libation corner. A reminder that the number for libation, should you choose to contribute, is 07 9 444 313 66. Today is the 27th of January 2020, and in today's libations, I will share some libations, and of course if you ring in, all that will happen is that I will stop, allow you to make your contribution, and continue the libations that I am sharing this evening. So on the 27th of January, we go back to the year 1891, 129 years ago. We remember one of our ancestors by the name of W. Murray, who on this day in 1891 received the patent for attachments for a bicycle. So we were busy inventing all kinds of things, you know? So, you know, nowadays when we ride and we have our attachments on our bicycles, we know that in the background somewhere there was an African who we need to thank for that, an ancestor by the name of W. Murray. Moving on to the 29th. The 29th of January, and we go back to the year 1901. So what's that one? That's 100. 119 years ago. One of our ancestors by the name of G.T. Woods patents an electric railway. So you think about what that means. London Underground operates on the on the basis of electric railways. All of the metros and subways of the metropolitan cities of the capitalist West operate on the basis of how can I put it? Of electric railways, and this, at the foot of it, has one of our ancestors as its as the owner of the patent, G.T. Woods. And moving on to the 30th of January, and this time we only go back to the year 1984, because one of our brothers by the name of L. Turner patented a particular design of barbering shears. Now you see, what happens is we invent in the things that we do. One of the things that we have never given up is we've never given up the task of looking after our own hair. We may have allowed other people to sell us food through supermarkets. We may have allowed other people to do all kinds of things for us, create clothes for us to wear and all kinds of things. But when it comes to the care of our hair, we've understood that that's our issue to deal with. And so it's only natural that the inventions that care for our hair should come from African people. So this is not even an ancestor as such. This is, as far as I'm aware, L. Turner. I'm not sure whether he's with the ancestors or alive and well with us now, but he patented a particular set of barbering shears in 1984, in the lifetime of many of us listening to this program today. And as we continue in the Libation Corner, we move on now to the 2nd of, the 2nd of February. And we remember one of our ancestors by the name of Ernest Just. And he received a particular medal, something called the Spingarn Medal, for his pioneering research on the fertilization and cell division in 1915. So this is deep biological research. This is the process by which we grow. This is the process that's inherent in the fetus as it grows into a child in the womb of the mother. And so one of our ancestors was deeply, Ernest Just was deeply involved in researching that process, so deeply involved that he was awarded the Spingarn Medal for his pioneering research. So we remember this ancestor for his great contribution to humanity. And the final contribution that I'm going to make in the Libation Corner this week will be to remember that on the 2nd of the 2nd of February, going back to the year 1807, that's more than 200 years ago. What's that? 213 years ago. The US State and Congress legally banned what they called the foreign slave trade. Now, I mention this because we must remember that on the 1st of January 1807, Britain claimed that it banned what it called the slave trade. So this piece of history shows us how closely together the European imperialists in Britain and the European imperialists in US Satan were working. They were effectively one in the same, even though they had their Boston Tea Party. And according to the story of their Boston Tea Party, US Satan, gained its independence from Britain. They still worked very closely, so closely that they could agree on this notion that they call the abolition of the slave trade. It's useful to remember these aspects of the history. And I think that brings us to the close of the Libation Corner this week.
I said I miss you, 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 baby. I just can't do without you.
So that brings the Libation Corner to a close for this week. And what we're going to do today, as I've mentioned, is we're going to begin our work on the strategy of Nkrumah. Let me just say this, that I've been looking at Marcus Garvey in previous weeks and Nkrumah this and successive weeks. I have been looking specifically at the strategy and not been doing the whole life story or biography of these greats, which is more the domain of the historian. And so, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the early life. I didn't spend a lot of time on the early life, for instance, of Marcus Garvey. And these are things that we can do another time because the history is important. And so if people want these things to happen, we can do this, another time. And in relation to the Osache for Kwame Nkrumah, again, I'm not going to focus on his early life. It's very interesting. There are important lessons to be learnt there. But because we're focusing on the strategy, I'm working from, effectively, the Second World War, where Kwame Nkrumah, at that stage, would have been a middle-aged man. He would have been in his late 30s, mid to late 30s, moving in the direction of 40, and in fact, possibly his 40th birthday would have happened. His 40th birthday came after the World War, so he would have been in his mid 30s at the point at which I take up Kwame Nkrumah. In the case of Marcus Garvey, I took up his story from the point when he was in his 20s. So his actual, direct organising activities really started in his 20s. With Kwame Nkrumah, his direct organising also started at that age, but his international scale organising really comes into being, or comes into a new dimension after 1945. So the point at which we engage with Nkrumah is just after the Second World War, and the book here just contextualizes in a limited way. It doesn't go into detail, but it contextualizes in a limited way the circumstances that existed at that point in history, because those are the circumstances that were informing the strategy of Nkrumah. So it's chapter 3. We are now on 3.1, which is entitled Environment and Context. And 3.1.1 is entitled The Second World War Devastated Imperialism. Now let me just say that in this section I'm going to quote one of our he's now an ancestor. I'll quote a few times from this particular ancestor by the name of Babu. Babu is an important character to know. He was not a fan of Nkrumah's, actually. He had some disagreements with Nkrumah, and they were contemporaries. He was the deputy leader in what became Tanzania. So he was the leader of the revolutionary process in Zanzibar, small island off the east coast of Africa. Zanzibar, I think the actual meaning of the term Zanzibar is the black sand. And Zanzibar and Tanganyika were brought together to make one nation. So Tanganyika was headed by Julius Nyerere. So you had Julius Nyerere, who was the leader of what would become Tanzania. When Tanganyika and Zanzibar were put together, they became Tanzania. So you had the leader of Tanzania was Julius Nyerere, and the deputy was Babu. And so you'll hear one or two quotes from Babu in the opening few pages of this chapter. But I'll let you know which words are his when I actually say them. Now, there were, just to give you a context, there were differences of view between the Osajefo Kwame Nkrumah and Nyerere and Babu, of course, on the way forward for Pan-Africanism. There were even differences of view between Babu and Nyerere. And Babu at one point was actually imprisoned. So, you know, the differences were intense. I have to say that later, just to give a little bit of context, later, well after Nkrumah had crossed to meet the ancestors, and before Nyerere himself crossed to meet the ancestors, so this is in the 1990s, Nyerere was big enough to admit that Nkrumah was actually right in his notions of Pan-Africanism and African unity. We have to give credit where it's due that Nyerere could do that. Nkrumah had crossed to meet the ancestors long before, in 1972, in fact. The 27th of April 1972 was the date that he actually crossed to meet the ancestors. But, 20-odd years later, Nyerere was big enough, he was African enough to acknowledge that Nkrumah was right. And of course, it was the correct thing to do, and it's obvious that that was the case because of the mess that Africa was in then and continues to be in now, mainly because we have a leadership that refuses to activate the strategy laid down for us by Marcus Garvey and taken up and even enhanced by Kwame Nkrumah. So that's just a little bit of a background to what I'm about to read. So let's continue. So the paragraph or the chapter starts like this. The Second World War led to massive infighting amongst the imperialists, which devastated their social, political and economic infrastructures. I'm quoting here from Babu. Babu writes, Europe emerged devastating from the ravages of war against fascism, and capitalism faced imminent collapse. The United States, as he called it, US Satan as I call it, hastened to the rescue with its Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and the establishment of NATO being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. End quote. The war weakened imperialism to the point of impairing its ability to maintain control over the colonized world. In a desperate attempt to retain control over the colonies, the imperialists, under the newly established leadership of US Satan imperialism, convened the Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944. This conference marked the regrouping of imperialism for the purpose of overcoming its economic crisis and maintaining US Satan hegemony over the world. The conference was the brainchild that launched the plethora of modern-day capitalist killer institutions which reap havoc in the world today. Both the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD for short, colloquially referred to as the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund came into being as a direct result of Bretton Woods. So let me just be clear that the real name, or the technical name for the World Bank, is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So whilst we're using the colloquial term World Bank, the technical people are calling it the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And so when they don't want us to understand what they're talking about, they call it the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And so none of us know what they're talking about. So we're just decoding some of that madness. And of course, a mention was made there also of the IMF, what has been, the International Monetary Fund. That's what IMF stands for, International Monetary Fund. I've heard people refer to it as the International Murdering Fund. It's an apt description of the wickedness that they get up to. But it's another lending institution. It's an institution that lends money, particularly to governments. That's the IMF and the World Bank perform these functions. They lend money to governments. And in the case of African governments, they have a kind of a schedule that they put into place of who they regard as the best clients to lend money to. And if they think that you're a good client, they lend you money at a low rate. And if they think you're a bad client, they lend you money at a high rate. So they give you a whole nation a credit rating in that sense. And of course, African nations don't just have a bad rate, they have the worst rate of everyone. And so when they make loans to African nations, they are made at rates that guarantee that it will be impossible to pay it back. And we're talking about whether it's African nations inside Africa or African nations in the diaspora. So many of you will know that Jamaica became heavily indebted, that's an African nation outside of Africa, became heavily indebted to the IMF under this principle and was made to pay millions of dollars, was made to devalue its money, was made to do all kinds of wickedness against the people of Jamaica in order to repay debts. So what they do is they put you in a situation where you cannot actually repay the debts. You have to keep on paying them and paying them and paying them. And if you do anything to guard the welfare of your people, if you do anything, like this country has an NHS, if they tried to build an NHS, they would get slapped down by the IMF or the World Bank, because the IMF and World Bank will say, well, how dare you build a hospital for your people when you haven't paid us the loan? And so in this way, African nations are kept imprisoned by these loans. And so Babu makes a quote here, and I'm going to read Babu's quote. He says, "The objective of the World Bank and the IMF was to ensure that no one strayed outside the sphere of interest of the new leader of the bourgeois powers." So in other words, US Satan which was now the king of imperialism after World War II, US Satan was at the heart of creating these two institutions, and the purpose of those institutions was to ensure that it remained the king of the world. One of the things that I don't mention in the book, for instance, is that at that conference, the Bretton Woods Conference, which created the IMF and the World Bank, at that conference, it was also agreed that the dollar would be the currency of the world. So you know that oil is bought in dollars at the moment. At that point, in that conference, the dollar became linked to gold. They had what was called the gold standard at the time. And off the top of my head, I think it was no, I can't remember exactly what the actual amount was, but the dollar was pegged to gold. Gold backed the US Satan dollar, and so when you traded in the US Satan dollar at that point, you were in effect trading in gold. So that was the basis of the promissory note that existed at that point in time. Now that changed, just giving some background, in 1973, when US Satan had a president called Nixon, a character at the heart of what was called the Watergate scandal. I won't go into that, that's not quite the subject for today, but it may be something that we want to do at some point in the future. But I mentioned Nixon because what happened is in the late 1960s, France was having an economic war with US Satan. 1960s now, just to give a little bit more context, in 1968 was when Britain joined what was then called the EEC, the European Economic Community. That's when Britain actually joined the EEC, and the world was reshaping, or the imperialist world was reshaping, and France launched an attack as part of this EEC. It launched an attack against US Satan, and the nature of the attack, the economic attack that many of us don't actually know of, the nature of that attack was to demand that US Satan repay all of its debts to France in gold. That was the demand made by France. Now, US Satan, aware that it did not have enough gold to cover its debts, then floated the US Satan currency. It was under the Nixon regime that the US Satan dollar was delinked from the gold standard. It was linked to the gold standard at $34 an ounce. That's what it was. Yeah, it was $34 to an ounce of gold. And so it was delinked at that point because US Satan would not have been able to pay its debt. It didn't have enough gold to repay its debts to France. And so the dollar floated, and eventually it was linked to oil. And now oil provides the base for the US Satan dollar, which is one of the reasons why these days they're in the Middle East all the time, causing wars, etc., over oil, is because at the base of the dollar, even though it's a floating dollar, at the base of the dollar is oil. And they have to be able to control oil to prevent the dollar from going into total free fall. This is why they have good relations with the Saudis, for instance. And this is why they had good relations even with Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And it's when Saddam Hussein said he's going to change the sale of Iraqi oil into euros rather than dollars, that's when they got vexed with him and went down there, killed him off and did all the mayhem that they were doing, etc. I know that this is moving slightly away from Nkrumah, but it's all part of the context within which we examine Nkrumah, because Nkrumah was a giant, not just in Africa, but in the world. The policies that he was bringing forward were going to change the world beyond anything that we can recognize now. So we have to understand what's going on at the world level in order to understand the strategy of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. So you can see that behind Kwame Nkrumah you have on the other side of Kwame Nkrumah you have U.S. Satan imperialism on the one hand. Opposing U.S. Satan is also, and I'm saying opposing within the imperialist camp, you have the EEC. They're competitors. They fight each other. They don't show us sometimes that they're fighting, but they're busy fighting each other. And these wars have implications for us because we pick up the bill for the wars between them. And then on the other side, you had the Soviet Union, which does not exist today as the Soviet Union. At this point, the point that I was talking where Nixon was president of U.S. Satan, Brezhnev was the leader of Russia. He was the president of Russia at that time, and so there were pitched battles going on between U.S. Satan and Europe. Were arguing against each other, but they were united in their battle against the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was fighting the two of them. Yeah, the Chinese were not big enough yet to really be in this fight. They were there, but they were not really big enough yet to really be mixing in that fight that was going on. But then what happened is when all of them started to fight amongst each other, the manifestation of that fight came out in Africa. So when they stopped, they call it the Cold War. When they stopped pointing the guns at each other after World War II and then started to attack each other economically, attack each other politically, behind the scenes slapping each other, but not actually warring, where the physical war started to show itself was in Africa. And this is why in Africa, we see that in the Congo, even to this day, estimates of between 6 and 12 million African people have died in the Congo. This is where the Cold War, as it's called, is hot. As you know, Russia arms one side, US Satan and the Europeans arm the other side, and then Africans kill Africans. It really is. It really is that that bad and grotesque. In the Sudan, 5 million people. How in the Rwanda slaughter, the genocide in Rwanda, how on earth? Where did the weapons come from for this slaughter to happen? They came from outside. In Sierra Leone, where hundreds of thousands of our people died in war. Again, the weapons came from outside. We don't have gun factories in Africa. They came from outside. So in Uganda, where 1 million Acholi people were slaughtered under the Museveni government, for instance, it comes from outside. US Satan backing them, giving them arms. At the moment, you've got Ugandan soldiers in Iraq. So that when the bombs came raining from Iran on Iraq the other day, some of the soldiers in the bunker hiding were actually Ugandans. Because what they do is they send contractors there so that their boys don't get sent back in coffins wrapped in, the Star Spangled Banner or whatever they call it. What they do is they send contractors in so that when they get killed, they don't have to announce that a US Satan soldier has been killed. And the other thing that they do is they send African soldiers in so that when they get killed, They don't have to report to their people that any US Satan soldiers have been killed. So all of this double talk, triple talk, lies and deception are all part of the environment that we need to understand in order to make sense of the strategy of the Osagyefo, Kwame Nkrumah. Let me come back to the book now. So reading on, other capitalist killer institutions that emerged in the immediate aftermath of this process were the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, known as GATT. So you'll hear me say GATT sometimes. GATT stands for General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which in 1995 was transformed into the World Trade Organization. So this institution is called the World Trade Organization. It comes out of the Bretton Woods Conference. They couldn't agree on it in that conference, and so it came into existence a few years later. But what they did is they created the IMF, the World Bank, and what today is called the World Trade Organization. And they used those institutions to control the colonized world, and in fact to control as much of the world as they can, even parts of the world that are not colonized. So reading on, in order to promote imperialism's theft through trade, the United Nations was brought into existence, and as imperialism's unofficial police force. So the other part of this, the United Nations, remember the League of Nations, was transformed into the United Nations in the late 1940s. So all of this is happening. But 1945 was the end of the Second World War, and between 1945 and 1950, you have all of these things, these new institutions developing. So the United Nations comes into existence in 1948, as an update, if you like, of the League of Nations, the same League of Nations that Garvey warned us that we must be not only wary of, but that we will one day have to fight. He could see what was coming. I'm going to read from Babu here again, or quote from Babu here again. Babu makes this assessment. He says, the imperialists recognized themselves after the Second World War. Sorry, let me say that again. My apologies. The imperialists reorganized themselves after the Second World War and consolidated their position by first sending massive aid to Europe through the Marshall Plan. Secondly, by stabilizing the international credit system through the IMF. And thirdly, by establishing an elaborate system of money lending, especially in underdeveloped countries, through the World Bank and its subsidiaries. So, what Babu is doing there, in short, is he's explaining, some of the things that I was just highlighting. That these three institutions, well, in fact, it's four institutions, because the United Nations is actually the police force of imperialism. Have you noticed how they get sent in to African countries and leave devastation as a result? Who was responsible for the murder, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, for instance? Now, yes, the likes of Kasavubu, who was one of our enemies within at the time, were there. The likes of Mobutu, definitely another one of our enemies within, were there in the Congo at the time, working against Patrice Lumumba, and directly they were the ones who were responsible for, if you like, pulling the trigger for actually the physical murder. But the institution that organized the capture of I'm talking about on the ground now. The institution on the ground that organised the capture of Patrice Lumumba was actually the United Nations. They were intimately involved in seeing to it that Patrice Lumumba was captured and thereby assassinated, so that the richest part of the richest continent in the world would stay in the hands of, or under the control of, US Satan and Western imperialism. So all of this is part of what the so-called United Nations does. In the African outpost in the Caribbean called Haiti, or Haiti, in Haiti, recently, there was the earthquake in Haiti going back about 10 years now. 10 years ago. And many of our people lost their lives in that earthquake. And then what they did, they sent the United Nations in. And the United Nations troops brought with them a cholera epidemic that killed more of our people. Everywhere they go in the African world, the United Nations causes havoc. Their job is to undermine and destroy African sovereignty. Not that we have any nations in the world at this point in time that are sovereign, but they want to make sure that there's absolutely no chance of that. So they are the police force that try to give a sense of legitimacy to the wrongdoings of imperialism. So reading on. The determination of colonial peoples to be free, coupled with imperialism's weakness due to war, meant that imperialism's loss of control over its African and other colonies was now inevitable. So, at the end of the war, imperialism is weak, and people on the ground in Africa and other places are beginning to realise this and are starting to make their move. And remember, in 1947, India becomes independent from Britain. That's straight after the Second World War. In 1949, you have the Chinese Revolution. They break away as well. And so you get a sense that they can't hold on, the imperialists can't hold on, and their biggest nightmare is that Africa will release itself. But let's read on. This meant that it had to solve the problem of how to continue its theft of colonized people's resources after the colonies gained formal political independence. It responded by setting up killer institutions to facilitate its theft of the colonies' resources through economic domination and exploitation. The primary purpose of the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, now World Trade Organization, and the United Nations was to facilitate and maintain imperialism's domination of the independent former colonies by proxy through new global economic institutions. So understand this point well. Before independence was granted, if we can use it, if we can express it in those terms, not that it really was granted, but before independence was granted, what they did is they built institutions to keep us under control, even when we thought we were independent. So that's what was going on here. They were building up these institutions to make a mockery of what they were going to call independence later on. So they were thinking a step ahead. They're not stupid. They were thinking a step ahead. They knew that they were too weak to hold us down. They knew that if we started to fight them, that they couldn't really do anything about it. So they were planning on how to come over to us like they're the nice guys, that they're allowing us to have independence, and at the same time they were planning on how to make sure that we could never truly be independent. And these institutions were at the heart of ensuring that we could never be truly independent, or that they would never allow us. We can be independent, but they would never allow us to be independent. We're going to have to allow ourselves. The formation of these new killer institutions were an important milestone marking the ushering in of a critical change in capitalism's historical development. They symbolize capitalism's move from colonial to neocolonial methods of domination. exploitation and oppression, and its periphery from the industrial, and its periphery from the industrial to financial capital domination at its core. So let me just explain that. Now, in the first stages of capitalism, what you had was industrialization. The industrialists were the Dungargans of capitalism. So, your Henry Fords, for instance, motor car manufacturers, they were the Dungargans of capitalism. They were the ones that run things as far as capitalism was concerned. But then, when you had World War II, during World War II, what then happens in places like Britain and Germany and those other places, what then happens is the bombing of the various places means that you can't, they can't produce in the way that they used to. Their factories are not operating at the level that they were operating before the World War. So they just can't make things, with the rapidity and efficiency that they were able to make things with before. They just can't do that. Yeah. And so what then happens is that creates a space. It creates a space for the financial capitalists to come and take over and run things. The financial capitalists, in a nutshell, are the bankers. Okay, you can talk about insurance and all of the other bits and pieces around it, but to keep it simple, shorthand, we just call them the bankers. So now the bankers come out and they bail out the industrial capitalists. They need the industrial capitalists. They can't just slap them down too hard. So what they do is they bail them out with loans. They give them loans. And so the financial capitalists have to repay, the industrial capitalists have to repay the financial capitalists, for the loans that help them to rebuild their industries. And that system of loaning to the industrial capitalists puts the finance capitalists as the new Dungargan of capitalism, the ones that run things. So we have a situation which is true in the world now, where the bankers are the Dungargans. And when the bankers mess up, it messes up things for everyone. Incidentally, if we want to understand what interest rates really represent, I don't watch TV anymore, but they used to have on the news on TV on a regular basis. I don't know if they still do it. They always used to tell you what the interest rates, and they used to tell us that if the interest rates are high, we get more money, interest payments in our bank account. If the interest rates are high, we have to pay higher mortgages. Yeah. If the interest rates are low, then the payments that we get are low. On our bank accounts, the interest payments on our bank accounts are low. If the interest rates are low, then the amount of money that we have to pay on our mortgages is also low, and that's the way that they explain it to us. Yeah, but the truth of the matter, the truth of the scenario is this: is that when interest rates are low, it means the finance capitalists are weak. And when interest rates are high, it means the industrial capitalists are weak. There's a battle going on between finance capitalists and industrial capitalists. There's an actual battle that's going on between the two of them. And when the industrial capitalists are strong, they take the position, we're not going to pay any kind of high interest rates to bankers. So they must bring it down, bring it down low, as it is at the moment. Yeah, and when the industrial capitalists get weak, the finance capitalists just say, well, you're just going to have to pay us some high amount of interest now, and they nail them with some big interest payments. And this is why now here in Britain they've created a what you call a committee. It used to just be left up to the Chancellor of the Exchequer to decide the interest rates. Now they've got a whole committee they put together to do it, of industrial capitalists and finance capitalists, because they want to cool down the war between industrial capitalists and finance capitalists. So when you hear interest rates are low, it means the finance capitalists are weak, as is the case right now. The bankers have been getting a lot of slaps over recent years, so interest rates are low. They're even down in the minus. That's how bad the bankers are right now. And when you hear the interest rates are high, it means that the finance capitalists are fully in charge, and they're putting the industrial capitalists under heavy-duty manners. But reading on, the determination of colonial peoples to free themselves, coupled with imperialism's weakness due to war, meant that imperialism's loss of control over its African and other colonies was now inevitable. This meant that it had to resolve the problem of how to continue its theft of colonized people's resources after the colonies gained formal political independence. It responded by setting up killer institutions to facilitate its continued theft of the colony's resources through economic domination and exploitation. The primary purpose of the IMF, the World Bank, and GATT, now the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations was to facilitate and maintain imperialism's continued domination of the independent former colonies by proxy through global-level economic institutions. The formation of these new killer institutions were an important milestone marking the ushering in of a critical stage in capitalism's historical development. They symbolized capitalism's move from colonialism to near-colonial methods of domination, exploitation and oppression, and its periphery, and from industrial to financial capital at its core. This is the background that I just wanted to touch on as we now move in to section 3.12. Section 3.12 is entitled African Strategic Self-Defense, the 5th Pan-African Congress. So what I've just been explaining in an abbreviated way is the international context within which, or the enemy context really, within which Pan-Africanism has to navigate and develop in order to liberate Africa. Now let's begin to look at Africa. In fact, before we look precisely at Africa, let's just do a little musical interlude.
Yeah, baby.
A question was posed to me. When does a man that truly loves a woman stop loving a woman? And I suggest that when a man truly loves a woman, he'll never stop loving that woman. In this particular instance, this song was developed as a representation of that love through rap, through song, and poetry. This is our expression.
Stop loving when the sky turns green. It's no longer blue when I look in your eyes, and no longer see you. That's when I stop loving you, when I lose my mind and the sun don't shine. Let's see I'm no longer found when I saw your face, such a warm embrace. I prayed to God, so please
grows cold and icebergs heat up. When Rockefeller decides to drink from the pocket. When the sky turns green and it's no longer blue. When I look in your beautiful eyes and I no longer see you. When the raging rivers no longer flow and begin to dry. When beautiful birds that my wings no longer fly. When thunder becomes lightning and lightning becomes thunder. When the kangaroos no longer roam the land down under. When time stops and life stands still. When diamonds and pearls begin to bloom like daffodils. When magnificent mountaintops are no longer tall. When the great pyramids of Giza begin to crumble and fall. When those that die once again live. When prosperity can be found in a man-made field. When the rich give all their money to the poor. When people in pain seek to cry no more. Baby, that's when I'll stop loving you.
Time right here. One time right here, right here. Like a hawk, I spotted this goddess with this hypnotic walk. Her body's melodic talk had me fighting the right thought. Midas cloth draped over her conceited physique. Her third eye heard mine, so I proceeded to speak. Excuse me, miss, you may or may not be used to this. I just wanted to know how you doing. If that's not too much to ask, you in a rush, I passed. I knew she had pizzazz, she kinda blushed and laughed. Nice conversation with no complications. Exactly what I want, no front, no faking. I came with no kind of game, so through the rain and sunshine, time to put us in the same frame of mind. We can ride, stride for stride, make the sun and moon collide. Put some stars we can guide by side. See the game, so the past don't mean a thing. I'm a protector, disrespecter, watch me bring the pain. When change a single thing, put your hand in mine. And in demanding times, watch how your companions shine. One understanding too is me and you. Every day is something new, and I'ma never stop loving you.
When fish walk on land and have no need for water. When girls become sons and sons become daughters. When glitter no longer has the gleam. When arrogance loses all its self-esteem. When the joys of the past become the pains of today. When I lose my mind and I can't find. When those who were blind can now purchase their sight. When countries that rule the world no longer seek to fight. When a killer won't kill, a thief won't steal, reality ain't real, a banker won't deal, feelings won't feel, and wounds don't heal. That's when I'll stop loving you.
Stop loving you. When will I stop loving you? When the sky turns green, it's no longer blue. When I look in your eyes and no longer see you, that's when I stop loving you. When I lose my mind and the sun don't shine, that secret place I no longer found. When I saw your face, such a warm embrace, I prayed to God, so plead my case. You stole my heart, fulfill my song. We have the greatest love story that's ever been told. When the killer won't kill, our thief won't steal, it ain't real. And the baker won't deal. When feelings don't feel, wounds won't heal. That's when now stop loving me.
When Will I Stop Loving You by Arman Rashidi. Of course, we will never stop loving the African woman. So we have to make that as a clear promise to our sisters. Never stop loving the African woman. So we've looked at some of the context immediately after the Second World War. Now let's look at some of the African responses that came out during that period. So again, the heading of this section is section 3.12, and it's African Strategic Self-Defense, the 5th Pan-African Congress. The Pan-Africanist movement responded to imperialism's aggressive onslaught by convening the 5th Pan-African Congress. This move was designed to counter imperialism's agenda of reaffirming and consolidating its hold over Africa and other colonized peoples of the world. Pan-Africanism was at the heart of the battle between the thieving imperialist forces on the one hand and the masses of Africa and other colonized people on the other. The battle was for control of the land upon which the masses lived. The 5th Pan-African Congress, held in 1945, was a critically important milestone in the development of the Pan-African movement and overall African liberation process. It was the first Congress where, 1, large numbers of African people from the motherland were present, were represented by delegates from their zones. 2, the meaning and purpose of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism were discussed at length by the delegates. 3, the overall, the objective of the masses of Africa achieving state power was clearly established. And 4, it brought together the three hitherto competing brands or strands of Pan-Africanism, led by Garvey, Dubois, and Padmore. That's Marcus Garvey, William Burkamp Dubois, and George Padmore, respectively. Previous congresses were limited in that they had focused on complaining and protesting to colonizers about the ill treatment of Africans under colonialism, rather than procuring power. Now, before reading on, let me just say this. So, what we had in the 1920s and 1930s were really bitter disputes between different strands of Pan-Africanism. Very well publicized are the battles that happened between the Garvey and Dubois branches of Pan-Africanism. So they were at each other's throats, not physically, they were not physically fighting, but they were at each other's throats in debating terms. Yeah? And they were grappling to try to give some definition. They didn't realize that that's what they were doing at the time, but we can look back now and we can see that that's what they were doing. They were grappling to give some sort of definition to Pan-Africanism. And so they were arguing about what is Pan-Africanism. It didn't come out as an argument over what is Pan-Africanism. It was basically what's the best way forward. And so they were cursing each other. And in the 1920s, this battle was particularly strong between the UNIA and the NAACP, or the Niagara Movement. That's the W.E.B. Du Bois side of Pan-Africanism. Now, Garvey, we can now look back and we can see that Garvey's interpretation of Pan-Africanism was much stronger, much more meaningful than Dubois'. But that battle had to happen in order for us to come properly to that understanding. And then in the 1930s, there's a different battle that takes place. And at the heart of that battle, again, is the UNIA. The UNIA now is battling with the George Padmore branch of Pan-Africanism. Remember, George Padmore, whom we don't hear a lot about, he was a powerful character who developed a Pan-Africanist movement here in Britain. And eventually he goes on to work in Russia, to become part of the Politburo in Russia. So he was, his commitment was deeply socialist. And eventually what happens is, after he's working in Russia, he realizes that the Russians are making agreements with US Satan. As Europeans, they're making agreements with each other which are to the disadvantage of Africa. And no matter how much he tells them, no, you're not supposed to do that, you're betraying African people by doing that, they continue to make agreements with their biological cousins to Africa's detriment. And so he leaves Russia and comes back into the Pan-Africanist fold and starts to organize as a Pan-Africanist. In fact, he wrote a book called Pan-Africanism or Communism, a very important book where he shows that the Russian brand or Russian strand of socialism or communism, whatever label would choose, people may choose to put on it. Those labels are not accurate, but whatever label people choose to put on it, he shows that that it's not in our interest in the way that they're doing it. We have to do it in our way for it to operate in our interest. So he gets kind of pushed back into the Pan-Africanist fold. Now, in 1940, on the 10th of June 1940, literally, a year after World War I starts, Garvey dies. So Garvey crosses to meet the ancestors. Now, whether that was, just completely natural causes or whether it was something more sinister, we probably will never actually know. But the point is that Garvey is not around when we come to 1945 at the 5th Pan-African Congress. And so at the 5th Pan-African Congress, Garvey's organization, the UNIA, is involved in the Congress. Dubois is involved in the Congress. And Padmore and his branch are involved in the Congress. So the Jamaica branch of the UNIA sends representatives to Garvey, and Garvey's second wife, Amy Jakes Garvey, is intimately involved in the planning of the 5th Pan-African Congress, even though she doesn't actually attend. Yeah, so we've got to understand the restrictions, the difficulties. It's just after the end of World War II. It's not that easy just to jump on a ship and come over, So many ships have been destroyed as a result of war, etc., etc. So there are all of these kinds of dynamics that are going on, but she was not present. But Marcus Garvey's first wife is Amy Ashwood Garvey. She is present, and not only is she present, she chairs the proceedings on one of the days of the Congress. So we can see that what you have is a coming together of the different branches of Pan-Africanism in that 5th Pan-African Congress. And this is the reason why it stands out as the most important of all of the Congresses. Study the Congresses, but if you can only study one, the one to study is the 5th Pan-African Congress, because that has more meaning, frankly, than all the rest of them put together. So reading on. The 5th Pan-African Congress, held in 1945, was a critically important milestone in the development of the Pan-Africanist movement and the overall African liberation process. It was the first Congress where, one, large numbers of African people from the motherland were represented by delegates from their zones. Two, the meaning and purpose of Pan-Africanism and African nationalism were discussed in great length by the delegates. Three, the objective of the masses of African people of Africa achieving state power was clearly established. And four, it brought together three hitherto competing brands of Pan-Africanism led by Garvey, Dubois and Padmore respectively. Previous congresses were limited in that they had focused on complaining and protesting to colonizers about the ill treatment of Africans under colonization rather than procuring power. The 5th Pan-African Congress took a qualitative leap by demanding autonomy and independence, and African unity and self-determination, whilst moving towards an effective organizational framework for progressing the African liberation struggle towards achieving these ends. Delegates sought, one, to plan to work for the liquidation of imperialism. So they were looking to cut the throat of imperialism. And two, to demand for colonial peoples the immediate right of self-determination as a step in the process of banishing wars. So, what we were saying is we're going to get rid of imperialism and we're going to get rid of wars. And in order to get rid of wars, what we had to do was we had to have the colonies free. Once the colonies are free, once Africa is free and the other colonized parts of the world are free, there will be no basis for future wars. It's only because of our weakened position that others think that they can come and do what they like on our land. And then what happens is they start fighting with each other over who takes control of our land. But once we step up, once we stand up on our feet and give them 2 slaps and tell them you can't come here, there's nothing left for them to fight about. So we've got to understand our importance in ridding the world of war. We have a duty, not just to ourselves as African people, but to the world, to stand up and do what is right. Stand up as men and women and take charge of what is ours. Africa is ours. Let me continue reading. At the level of ideas, what Pan-Africanism stood for and against became clearer. Pan-Africanism stood for the unity and liberation of the whole of Africa under a just social system. It stood resolutely in favour of the socialist path of development. Furthermore, it demonstrated the symbiotic relationship between Pan-Africanism and socialism through its slogan, "Forward." This is a slogan of the 5th Pan-African Congress. It's forward to a united, forward to a socialist United States of Africa. Long live Pan-Africanism. So this was the slogan that they voted on and developed in the 5th Pan-African Congress. Let me read that again. It's forward to the Socialist United States of Africa. Long live Pan-Africanism. These are the words that they put forward from the 5th Pan-African Congress. Nkrumah made the point that, and I'm quoting Nkrumah, Nkrumah says, "It was no surprise when the Congress adopted socialism as its political philosophy." So this was Nkrumah's comment on that declaration which was made at the 5th Pan-African Congress. Pan-Africanism is therefore a critical objective, part of the broader aim of worldwide socialist revolutionary process. This automatically means that it also stands resolutely against capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, and settler colonialism. Pan-Africanism also stands against imperialist oppression of Asian and other non-African people. So, as with Garvey, the idea that we stand for ourselves, of course, but we are supportive of other oppressed people is still maintained strongly in Pan-Africanism. We're not against other people, we are for ourselves. The Congress organisers realised that unless the masses of African people were actively involved in the process, African liberation would remain a dream. As a result of that Congress, a concerted effort was made to mobilise the masses of African people on the African continent. Delegates returned to their homes and worked towards achieving power in their localities. Many of the delegates went on to play leading roles in the process that brought their countries to political independence. Nkrumah, the Joint Secretary of the Congress, would be the first to lead such a process. And so, you know, actually we've come on to section 3.2, but you know what, I'm going to drop a little bit of Arman Rashidi. Just another. Let me play another track from Arman Rashidi.
Ooh, oh my God, got to get fucked up.
That's all we got.
Ooh, oh my God, got to get fucked up.
Get your bunk on.
Ooh, oh my God, got to get fucked up. Ooh, oh my God, got to get fucked funked up.
Pop was a weasel, but the weasel wouldn't pop. Arrested by weak MCs and plastic hip-hop rhythm cops. But told by the Godfather a long time ago, beat you to the front gun play because you reap what you sow. But the player didn't listen and the team wouldn't play. So old school bowed down and knew where they bled to win. The wave got waters like a tree out of trunk. It ain't got that vibe unless it's got that funk.
Right on up, we're gonna fuck you right on up. Get your fuck up. We're gonna fuck you right on up. We're gonna fuck you right on up. Right on up, we're gonna fuck you right on up. We're gonna fuck you right on up. We're gonna fuck you right on up. Vibe for your mind. Vibe. We've got that vibe for your style. Vibe. We've got that vibe for your mind. Vibe. We've got that vibe for your style.
On the back burner you could just simmer around, but on the front burner you got to burn. On the back burner you could just simmer around, but on the front burner you got to burn. On the back burner you could just simmer around, but on the front burner you got to burn. On the back burner you could just simmer around, but on the front burner you got to burn.
Shield your eyes if you can't feel the vibe. I advise you chumps to hit the heels and hide, cause the skills have died and I'ma leave you broke. Think you know cause you rap about the weed you smoke. But this music is hard, so use it for smart. But you must got the light confused with dark. So holding the mic is like rolling the dice. C7 the soul for gold in the ice. I told you twice about games, I don't play none. Ready to explode since day one. I stay calm when they come. Have them dropping their faces and they palm. Like I dropped the A-bomb. Face with A-bomb and A-bomb. Good cover the cracks and the rhymes are right. Send the nurse and burst to no signs of light. And I shine the light and take flight with Rashidi. What you do is decide on the tape or the CD.
Vibe for your mind. We've got that vibe for your style.
Vibe.
We've got that vibe for your mind. We've got that vibe for your style.
From the pyramids to the project, to the project to the pen. From the jaws to the oppressor to the valley of the sea. From poverty to pain to the streets of confusion. From political metaphors to that tactic illusion. From 15 players to Project Hall of Famers. To graveyard gangsters that wanna be no names. But that ain't no MC. That's a boy being a fool who should have been listening while he was stripping in school.
Keep that vibe alive. 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 Get your groove on, come on. Oh my God, get funked up. Come on, oh my God, get funked up. Come on, oh my God, get funked up. Come on, oh my God, get funked up. Oh my God, get funked up. Come on, oh my God, get funked up.
So that was Vibe by Aman Rashidi, and teaching us to get funked, and I emphasize funked up. So as we continue, section 3.2, building a mass party for liberation and government. So section 3.21 is entitled Nkrumah on the importance of organization. Now, like Garvey, Nkrumah emphasized that organization essentially is everything. We must be well organized if we want to be a free people. And reading on, Nkrumah argued that organization decides everything. He was constantly calling for African people to join liberation organizations as a means to freedom. He emphasized that organizations set the parameters within which unity thrives, and unity was critical to liberation. He advised, and here's a quote from Nkrumah, one of the quotes that he gives us to emphasize the importance of organization. He says the following: "In order to restore self-government, we must unite. And in order to unite, we must organize. We must organize as never before, for organization decides everything. We have preached unity and organization, and we shall not tire of preaching these until self-government has been fully realized. We must organize in order to make an effective demand for the control of our own affairs, so that we can be in a position to remedy the innumerable economic and social ills which mar life in this country. We must organize in order to be able to break down the chains of imperialism." Those are the words of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, speaking on organization. Continuing. He was clear that the collective is superior to the individual, that it was the organization of collectives that brought power and common purpose, that such organization gave force to its leaders rather than the other way round. Collective organization was essential to victory. And he reminded us that, and this is another quote from Nkrumah now, quoting from Nkrumah, he says, "The history of colonial liberation movements shows that the first essential thing is organization. Some may say unity, but unity presupposes organization. At least there must be an organization to unify the country. One person cannot do it. A few leaders cannot do it. But when the masses of the leaders share common ideals and purposes, they can come together in an organization, regardless of tribal and other differences, to fight for the cause. Leaders may come and go. They may arise and fall. But the people live forever. And they can only be joined together by an organization that is active and virile in doing the things for which it was established. The role of an organization, especially in the colonial struggle, is of paramount importance, for victimization, bribery and corruption, defaulting of leaders and other vicissitudes are strewn in the way of such movements." End quote. In order to effect a socialist revolution, it is necessary to build a vanguard party pursuing socialist policies. That party must have mass support from workers, peasants, and their allies. In Africa, at that point in history, this meant a party of peasants, and it had to be actively campaigning, i.e. in the front line of struggle against the oppressor, in this case, the colonizers. The other critically important element is unity. Nkrumah understood the importance of this. In the spirit of Garvey, Nkrumah learned from and applied. In the spirit of Garvey, Nkrumah learned from and applied and adapted organizational practices of Lenin. Now, before I quote from Nkrumah, let me just say this: that Garvey had described Lenin as the greatest man on earth, and he made this description of Lenin in March 1924, when Lenin died, when he crossed to meet his ancestors. And so Garvey was emphasizing that the UNIA studied Lenin. They read the works of Lenin, etc., etc. And so here we have Nkrumah, decades later, some 2 decades later, emphasizing the same thing. And he says, this is a quote from Nkrumah, he says, "From Lenin, I took ideas for the party's local organization. Nobody introduced me to Marxism. It was the natural result of studying Hegel at the University of Pennsylvania. You see, our party is a mixture of things." End quote. So, Nkrumah was a member of the UNIA. He was a member of the Philadelphia branch of the UNIA whilst he was living in USA. And remember at the beginning of the program I said that I wasn't going to go into his early life. Well, part of his early life was that he was a student in US Satan. And he studied at the University of Pennsylvania. And there he was also taught by the great Claudia Jones, for instance. So he came into contact with some of the, some powerful revolutionaries whilst he was there. And when he was in Britain, he came to Britain later, he was in contact with powerful revolutionaries over here in Britain, which was all part of his development. But an important part of his development was being a member of the UNIA, the organization which Marcus Garvey created. Now, Nkrumah never met Marcus Garvey. He invited Marcus Garvey's wife. He worked with both of Marcus Garvey's wives and invited them to Ghana. So they came to Ghana, under his tutelage, if you like. But he, sorry, just bear with me. But he never, he always had a respect for both Garvey and his wives. I think that's the easiest way to put it. And he never forgot his time as being a member of the UNIA. And in his autobiography, he writes in his autobiography that the book that had the biggest impact on him was the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. Now that book was compiled by Amy Jakes Garvey, the second wife of Marcus Garvey. She was the one that was the editor that brought that book into being, that brought all of the speeches and documents, etc., into 2 volumes, which are now obtainable as one book, the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. So Garvey was a deep, deep, deep influence on Nkrumah, so deep that he actually says it in his autobiography. So Nkrumah had no problem borrowing ideas from other cultures, but he was clear that they had to be adapted for use in an African setting. In a short time, he built up a massive vanguard party infrastructure on the ground in the Gold Coast. .22 Building the UGCC towards a mass party for action. The UGCC will be explained in the text. Reading on. When Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast in late 1947, there were only 2 branches of the United Gold Coast Convention, the UGCC. That's what it stands for, United Gold Coast Convention. So there are only 2 branches of the UGCC in the whole country. He urged all organizations in the Gold Coast to affiliate to the UGCC and all of their members to join individually. Furthermore, he urged that new branches should be set up in every town and village. Unrelentingly, he travelled the whole country, stopping in every region, constantly explaining the aims of the UGCC. 6 months later, there were over 500 branches. This was a monumental movement stroke organisational building achievement. Now, let me just take a little step back here before reading on. So, Nkrumah in 1947 was here in London. He was studying at the London School of Economics. He was doing his PhD at the London School of Economics. And he received the call to come back to Africa. You're needed now. After the World War, what was needed was we need to get ready to release ourselves. India had made their move in 1947. We're now independent, and so it was time for Africa to do its part also. And so its best sons had to be called home. So Nkrumah was called home, and he was called home by a group of elders in the United Gold Coast Convention. and so he returned to Africa at that point, effectively to lead that liberation process. Now you got to remember, at the time we didn't have lots of people going to university and all this kind of stuff. We didn't have a massively literate population. So the few people that we had that were highly trained, highly educated, they were the centre, if you like, of our liberation movement. And we were fortunate that Nkrumah actually had his head screwed on. Many of them had been educated out of their minds, so that that they were basically in service to Europeans rather than working in service for African people. Now, so when he gets back, he gets to work immediately. That they didn't really know what they were doing. They called him back to help them. They didn't really know what they were doing, so they only had 2 branches. Within 6 months, he transforms that through his organising capacity into 500 branches. Can you imagine what that means? Now, the way that he did it, I haven't touched on it in the book, but the way that he did it was he was given access to a car, a little Beetle, one of those tiny little cars that you had in the old days. And so he would drive that car from village to village around the whole of Ghana. So he would drive from village to village. You must remember, there were no roads those times, yeah. So those journeys are just sort of 10 mile an hour, going over in potholes and out of potholes, etc., etc. It's a wonder that the car actually did it, but the car actually made it before it crashed out. Yeah, so he was able to get around the whole country and go to villages everywhere in the country. And everywhere he went, he created a branch of the UGCC until the UGCC became a powerful entity in Ghana. So now what you had was the Ghanaian people were now organized or members of a single organization, and that single organization was now developing itself, getting ready to take power. And you see, so this is the manifestation of the words that we heard from Nkrumah earlier, where he was explaining to us the importance of organisation. It's not important to talk about organisation. We must actually do it. And so he actually went out and did it. 500 branches. Let me read on. In the process, he also created and developed the UGCC's youth wing, the Commission on Youth Organisation. That was what it was called, the CYU, the Commission on Youth Organisation. This was to become an important catalyst for change by pressing the demand for self-rule now, rather than the vague demand of the UGCC elite for it in the shortest possible time. The British colonial oppressors became very alarmed at the rapid growth of this movement. Now, let's be very clear. So you had the effectively old men of the UGCC who were, too frightened to take power, saying, "Oh well, we'll take even though India's got theirs now, we'll take ours when it comes." Yeah, so we'll take control of the nation when it comes. They had no real plan for taking power. Well, of course they had no real plan. They only had 2 branches. Nkrumah brought 500 branches into being. It started a process of education amongst the people to help them to understand politically what they needed to do to take power. And the young people said, well, why are we going to wait until whenever they decide we want to take power now? And so the whole momentum was building up. Why should the Indians have independence and we don't have independence? So all those kinds of conversations, were actually going on at the time. And so we started to pressure the British. But what happened was the old men were saying, no, it's like they were frightened to be independent. No, we're not ready for it yet. They were kind of make out, we're too stupid to govern ourselves. It was that kind of backward thinking that the elders had. And the other thing that the elders had was they wanted simply to replace the Europeans. They wanted the Europeans to go, and then they wanted to take over and just carry everything on the same, except it's not the Europeans in charge now, it's them in charge. And of course this was unacceptable to the young people. So there was a schism building up between the young people who supported Nkrumah and the old people who really didn't know what they were doing and really didn't want true independence but just wanted to be in charge of things the way they were. Reading on. Nkrumah understood the critical importance of propaganda in making a socialist revolution. Through his often repeated slogan, propagandize without ceasing, that was his slogan, propagandize without ceasing, he constantly reminded everyone of his, constantly reminded everyone in his circle to cascade and advance progressive ideas. Propaganda was a development on formal education, which informed the masses at large. At the end, on the 3rd of September 1948, he established the Accra Evening News. So here we have it. Garvey created a newspaper called the Negro World. Following in the same mould, Nkrumah creates a newspaper called the Accra Evening News. Accra, by the way, being the capital of what today's Ghana, what then was the Gold Coast. Reading on. The newspaper had been in the making for some time, whilst he was organising in the UGCC, but was not appreciated by its leadership. So you see, the old men then were so backward that they didn't realise the importance of having their own paper. They hadn't studied Garvey, so they didn't know what they were talking about. They had a kind of rough sense that they wanted to be free, but they really didn't know what they were talking about. And in fact, they became a stumbling block, getting in the way. Continuing, the evening news became so popular that at times it was impossible to satisfy demand, since there was a lack of funds and printing capacity. So that, it became so popular they didn't even have enough money to print all of the papers for people each to have one. In addition, he established a program for developing schools and colleges. So what we see here is the importance of education, just as with Garvey, the importance of education. So he's a newspaper to educate the people, schools to educate the people, colleges to educate the people, literacy programs, to get the people reading and writing. All of these things were going on in the organising of Nkrumah. So not only is organisation important, but communication and education are critically important to the independence process, to the revolutionary process, to the process of us freeing ourselves. Now, through this UGCC work, Nkrumah raised the political temperature in the Gold Coast. He encouraged the people to demand immediate self-rule whilst facilitating activities designed to make it a reality through non-violent agitation. The situation reached boiling point when a chief named Nikwamna Boni called on the people to refuse to buy any goods from foreign shops. The people did as he asked. The boycott lasted for a month. Then, on the very day the boycott ended, that was May 28th, 1948, the police opened fire on ex-servicemen who were marching peacefully to Christiansburg Castle to present a petition to the governor. So they were marching to present a petition to the governor. And they were fired upon. And murder ensued. So we must understand that this was peaceful. These were unarmed people. They were led by the servicemen. Now the servicemen were Ghanaians who had fought for Britain in World War II. So you had this situation where they came back, and then they were saying, okay, we fought for you. Now we're coming to you and we're saying, look, we want our freedom. We're coming to you unarmed. We're soldiers. We could come to you armed, but we're coming to you unarmed. Yeah? And then what they do is they open fire on not only the unarmed soldiers, but the civilians also. Reading on. Sergeant Ajete, Corporal Atipo, and Private Otade Lamptey were murdered in cold blood, and a number of other ex-soldiers injured. It was not long before there was an eruption of retaliatory violence. The uprising resulted in a further 29 murders and 239 injuries. The UGCC leadership, including Nkrumah, were arrested, and this brought to a head the internal contradiction between the UGCC leadership, dragging their feet on the issue of an immediate self-rule on the one hand, and Nkrumah and the masses on the other, who wanted no further delays. The point had been reached where the youth could no longer work under the leadership of their conservative elders. So this, the schism is developing and is broadening. Urged on and supported by an assembly of 60,000 of Ghanaians' progressive youth, on the 12th of June 1949, Nkrumah became the founder and leader of the Convention People's Party, the CPP, a mass-based political organization in Ghana. The assembly was more than double that of the phenomenal achievement of the UNIA conventions held almost 3 decades earlier. At that gathering, the youth broke away from the conservative leaders of the United Gold Coast Convention, who had been dragging their feet in the process of achieving independent self-rule. The progressive youth demanded self-government now and formed a vanguard party to that end. So, you know, this is remarkable. So they called a meeting and 60,000 people attended the meeting. 60,000 people attended the meeting. This is really saying something. You must understand that when the UNIA called a meeting, 25,000 people attended. Now you've got more than 2.5 times that number in attendance at this meeting in Ghana. So we get a sense of the scale of the organizing that is necessary in order to achieve great strides in the African liberation process, in the process of liberating ourselves from colonialism. And now our problem, of course, is liberating ourselves from neocolonialism. But reading on, 3.23, the CPP, the vanguard party for liberation and government. From the outset, Nkrumah set about improving upon the organizational standards he had established in the UGCC. He sought to make the CPP an organization effective enough not only to win the critical battle for Ghana's independence, but to spearhead the independence movement in the whole of Africa. Now, I'm going to quote from the Osagyefo for Kwame Nkrumah here, where he explains further. The Osagyefo for Kwame Nkrumah says this. He said, no, this is from a biography. I apologize. This is not the Osagyefo. This is from a biography of Nkrumah, written by one of his contemporaries by the name of Bankole. Yeah, so Bankole writes, one of Nkrumah's favorite sayings is that organization decides everything. From the very start, he saw to it that the CPP built up an efficient democratic machine. Branches were established in various parts of the Gold Coast as well as in Monrovia, Ivory Coast and Nigeria. Full-time political workers were engaged and paid salaries. Nkrumah and the other members of the party carried out an educational program by giving regular lectures on political science and the history of national movements in other parts of the world. Vans equipped with loudspeakers were bought and used for propaganda purposes. This added a lot to the effectiveness of the CPP propaganda over that of the UGCC. And those activities were not confined to the large towns. The The CPP propaganda secretaries went out to meet the people in the villages and hamlets. Nkrumah himself travelled thousands of miles making political speeches and confounding his opponents. By this means, he kindled the aspirations of the people he sought to serve. All decisions and resolutions of the CPP are, according to its manifesto, democratically taken or arrived at by the representatives of all 4 regions which make up the country. Nkrumah and his lieutenants in the CPP were called hooligans, veranda boys, riffraff, and communists, but Nkrumah established strong discipline within his party, and in spite of the castigation of his former colleagues on the UGCC, he forged ahead with his plans for building the CPP in a strong political party. So what we have here is a parting of the ways, if you like, between the UGCC, which was the old men doing their thing, out of touch with reality, and the CPP, which was the young people under the leadership of Nkrumah, working flat out now to achieve independence. Now, let's just be clear on this, that Nkrumah was not kind of arrogantly working over and above the heads of his people. That wasn't what was happening. At that convention where 60,000 people gathered, Nkrumah was told that he had to be leader. He was trying to say, no, it's not for me to be the leader. Yeah, select a leader and I will support the leader. But they actually insisted that he had to be the leader. And there are some people that actually said that if he had dared to refuse, that the people would probably turn on him and kill him. So it wasn't that he was running after leadership. It was that it was thrust upon him and he had to do it. So they were saying to him, you're our best, our best cadre, if you like. You're the one that we want to be our leader. You're going to be our leader whether you want to be our leader or not. That's the way to elect leaders, not through arrogant individuals standing up thinking that they know best. Reading on, I'll read on for a few more minutes. I'm hoping that our brother Astamari may be arriving soon, but I'll read on for a few more minutes all the same. Nkrumah expressed the view that the CPP appealed to the people because this was the first national political party covering the whole country. It genuinely included Ashanti, the northern region, Northern Territories, and Transvolta. It also incorporated all aspects of the masses of the people, farmers, women, the youth, etc. In fact, the party was in many respects the party of youth, founded, followed, and supported by young women and men in their masses. Their commitment was critical to the success of the party. However, there was another critical ingredient, and this time I will quote Nkrumah. I'll quote Nkrumah. Let's hear what Nkrumah has to say. He says this: much of the success of the convention's People's Party has been due to the efforts of the women members. From the very beginning, women have been the chief field organizers. They have travelled through innumerable towns and villages in the role of propaganda secretaries and have been responsible for the most part in bringing about the solidarity and cohesion of the party. So fervent were these women, in fact, that while I was in jail and the party organisation was in its most critical period, I learnt that at a rally in Kumasi, a woman party member who adopted the name Ama Nkrumah, Ama being the female equivalent to Kwame, got up on the platform and ended a fiery speech by getting hold of a blade and slashing her face. Then, smearing the blood over her body, she challenged the men present to do likewise in order to show that no sacrifice was too great for the struggle for freedom and independence. Before long, we managed to collect together some motor vans to which we attached loudspeakers. These, together with the Accra Evening News, the Sekondi Morning Telegraph and the Cape Coast Daily Mail, did yeoman service in broadcasting the propaganda of the party and in keeping alive the spirit of nationalism. We succeeded because we had talked with the people, and in so doing knew their feelings and grievances, and we had excluded no one. For if a nationalist government is to succeed, every man and woman of goodwill must be allowed to play a part. That was the description of Nkrumah. And just reading on, the leader of the CPP, Nkrumah, carried out an outstandingly successful social revolution that removed British colonial rule and led to the Gold Coast being transformed into independent Ghana. With a base now established on African soil, this success simultaneously spearheaded the dismantling of European colonization in Africa and made Nkrumah the first African head of state to actively lead his people in independence from European colonial rule. So, I think it's important to understand here the advantage that Nkrumah had over Garvey. So Garvey was born in the diaspora. Garvey was born outside of Africa. And for some, it was difficult to accept Garvey. Many people in Africa accepted Garvey. But one of the difficulties in the relationship between H.I.M. Selassie, Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, and Garvey was that he, as a king or as an emperor, could not see this outsider, for want of a better way of putting it, coming in and being in charge of Africa over and above his head. He was a king. That's the way he saw it. He was a king. And who is this man to come in and say that he's the president of Africa? And this was part of the schism that undermined the relationship between the two of them. So one of the advantages that Nkrumah had was that he was born on the soil of Africa. And so that then took away all of the confusion, all of the kind of internal prejudices that we have between those of us that are born at home and those of us that were born abroad. So that was one way in which there was a positive influence. Another way in which there was a positive influence was that Nkrumah did not have to make his way back to Africa. He was born in Africa. Garvey had to make his way back to Africa. In fact, he never actually made it to the point of setting foot on African soil himself. He did all of this great work, but never actually made it onto African soil so that he could, set up an African nation for our people in Africa. But there was no barrier to the return of the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. He came out of Africa into the West and went back into Africa, was naturally immediately accepted by the masses of the people, and was then in a position to be able to set up government structures on the ground in Africa. Remember, Garvey set up government structures in New York, in enemy territory. And so because he set it up in enemy territory in New York, they were able to dismantle it. So all they did is they whipped up some trumped up charges against him. They got their kangaroo court together. They put him in their kangaroo court and then they threw him in jail. And then when even the Ku Klux Klan started to complain, they said, look, we hate Africans, but this guy is innocent. You know, even the Ku Klux Klan had to complain, it was so blatant. Yeah? So when even they started to complain, then what they did, they said, okay, we'll take him out of prison, but we'll put him on the first ship out of US Satan. So they took Garvey out of prison, yeah, because there were so many complaints about the kangaroo court and all the rest of it. They took Garvey out of prison, but they took him straight to the boat. You know, and they took his handcuffs off of him on the boat and then sent him away. Yeah? So when you build up a government in your enemy's land, your government is not yours. So Nkrumah's advantage was that he was able to build up our government on our land. And this was the biggest danger, because if Garvey had got onto our land and built up a government, it would have been all over at that point. This is why they worked so hard to make sure that he didn't get there. But they couldn't stop Nkrumah from getting there, so what they had to do is they had to, it had to be allowed. It had to happen. The government had to happen. And the beginnings of government had to happen, but then they had to use new techniques in order to thwart the development, the proper development of African government on the African continent. They had to use new techniques in order to prevent the whole of Africa coming together as one government. Understand that US Satan is one nation. It's got a whole heap of different states, even Hawaii out in the sea. Yeah, thousands of miles away. But it's one nation. And they understood that if you prevent Africa from becoming one nation, then you have all these little kind of, these little entities that have got no real power. Yeah, that can't fight off anything. Look at Libya the other day. Everybody just walk in there, just kill off the leader, do what they like. Yeah, so they understood that if they could keep Africa divided, that they could still maintain control of Africa. And you notice earlier we were discussing that they set up certain institutions. They set up the IMF, they set up the World Bank, they set up the World Trade Organization. It was called the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade at the time. They set up United Nations. They set up all of these institutions. Those institutions were to keep African nations under manners. Other nations too, but particularly African nations. So that's what they were doing amongst themselves. They were organizing themselves to keep us under manners. And then they were organizing us internally to keep us under manners. And the way that they organized us internally to keep us under manners was to draw lots of lines on the map and say, this one is Nigeria. This one is Benin. This one is Ethiopia. This one is South Africa. This one is, they called it Rhodesia. We call it Zimbabwe now. But, they had all their names for them. And if we can keep them all separate, and if we can keep them all arguing amongst themselves, then they'll never be able to fight us off. Because a united Africa, we give them 2 slaps when they come to the shores. And they know that. So they keep us divided internally in order to prevent us from giving them the 2 slaps that are necessary to prevent them to come into our shores. Because if we can prevent them from coming to our shores, then we will run things properly in our shores, and Africa will become the most powerful nation in the world. And Africans will be the richest and most powerful people in the world. Now, sisters and brothers, that time is coming anyway. Even with all the foolfulness that's going on amongst us, that time is still coming. Yeah? It's on its way. Yeah? And we have to prepare ourselves to be a part of the African success story that is coming. There isn't time for me to go into that now, because I have to welcome our brother Astamari. I was looking for my brother Astamari. I have to welcome our brother Astamari. I'll be glad to just continue. Yes, but I have to be respectful of our brother. I know that he's got a very important educational program to do. But yes, okay. So I'm gonna just read out a little something. I've been asked by a beautiful sister to read something. How could I decline? It becomes very difficult to decline, doesn't it? You see, I'm trying to do sweet talk now. Yeah. Now, I've got a leaflet in front of me, and it says, "The Griot Way Training. Learn African storytelling the Griot way with Griot Chinier." And it says, "Audition workshop at 7 p.m. Wednesday the 15th of January. I think that's gone. Yeah, so that one is already gone. So I'll move on to. It says I'll move on. It says underneath here, training 11th of March to the 24th of June 2020. Duration 16 weeks. So you're going to get 16 weeks of training here. Yeah. The times are 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Now I'm not noticing. Maybe I haven't. It may be that they're all on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So they're all on a Wednesday. So it's from the 11th of March to the 24th of June 2020, from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. It's a 16-week program, and it says the place where it's taking place is called Pink Palace, Frankham Street, and that's in Deptford, in the Deptford part of town. That's SE8 4RL. So that's Frankham Street, SE8 4RL. Now, if you want to make contact, you can go to the website www.shanty-t.com. I'll spell that for you. www.shanti-chi.com. www.shanti-chi.com. So you can go to that website. You can also call. There's a phone number here. The number to ring on is 07582 228 967. Let me give that number to you again. It's 07582 228 967. And there's also an email address here. And that email address is chicreations@shantychi.com. I'll spell that for you. CHICREATIONS. Chicreations at Shantychi, SHANTI-CHI.com. So that is one that I've been given, and there's another that I've been given. I'll just very quickly read through that. I think our brother Astamar, I don't want to hold him up any. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me also say AGA Tours presents Reawakening from African DNA pilgrimage trip to the Gambia. That's Gambia, and it says here the 20th of November 2020. So this is giving planning time for those people who are considering going to the Gambia. 7 nights, and it will cost £1,099 for 7 nights in the Gambia. It says here, register your interest now. Early bird deposits are £99, and that's only for the next few days. That's up until the 31st of January 2020. Now I'm going to invite our sister from Shanty-Chi. I'm going to invite our sister from Shanty-Chi just to come in very quickly and just to tell us a little bit about the storytelling and to see how we can all benefit from being instructed in the skills of storytelling. Yeah, and so warmest greetings to you, my sister. Welcome to Bless Radio.
Greetings, Bless Radio listeners. Greetings, Brother Omawali. Thank you very much. And thank you, Esther Mori, for giving me the little space before your program. Bless your heart. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I give thanks to the ancestors for bringing me here today.
Okay. So please, can you tell me a little something about this this special event that you have coming up? You're going to teach us how to speak proper.
No, I am not going to teach anybody how to speak proper. What I'm going to do. So this is a griot way training. So I'm a griot. I come from a long line of griots, and in this time, the griot tradition is under threat. And so it's incumbent upon me and other griots and storytellers to pass on those skills to make sure that our culture as melanin-rich people evolves. So storytelling is about passing on morals and principles and our culture and our heritage, and it's our inheritance. And so one of the things I'm going to be doing is for 16 weeks is looking really closely at the symbols and the messages that we have in our own stories. So earlier on we were talking about coding. So in African stories and proverbs, we have our own codes, and if we understood them, then we'd know how to use them more effectively and more efficiently, and that's part of becoming a united community, a united melanin-rich community, because we talk about all speaking one language. Well, I don't know if that's absolutely necessary, but understanding the codes of our stories, the codes that our ancestors passed on to us, is really important. So you'll learn the codes, you'll deconstruct and reconstruct an ancient story, you'll learn how to tell a story, engage an audience, and then we will perform at the prestigious Inne Argul African Storytelling Festival, which will be in July the 23rd to the 26th, 23rd to the 26th of July, where we create a nice African village on the landscape of Britain to remind ourselves of home and where we need to be going.
Can I ask, I just happen to be privy to a little bit more information, and I understand that there is a project underway to acquire land for a permanent African village here in Britain. Are you able to just share any information on developments in that project?
Well, at the moment it really is about raising the funds. So with regards to the festival, what we want to do is sell tickets, sell lots of tickets, get lots of people to come to the festival so we can raise the funds to buy some land in England, because we are here, and I think if we're going to be here, we should be landowners, not just paying rent or paying mortgage. Own the land, because when you own the land, then you have an entitlement and you have a different energy about you. If you're going to be here, own the land, not the house on the land, because if you're all, not leasehold, you're just paying for the air above the land. What you need is to own the land. And so we want to buy some land and create an African vibration village in Britain, so we can feel like we're home if we're going to be here. I personally, 3 to 4 years, aim not to be here, but I would like to leave a legacy for the people that are going to stay here for the next generation, and a storytelling village so that we can stay connected to our culture. And it should remain exclusively for melanin-rich people, so that we can, so we don't have to, because we're such a good-hearted people, whenever other cultures come into our space, we spend too much time focused on them, and we need to focus on ourselves, focus on our healing, and so we need to be exclusive. That's my view.
And one final question, and then our brother Astamari is going to come in. I know that you take people for night walks. What are night walks? What exactly are night walks? Can you tell me? I mean, I get this image of being terrified in darkness.
Night walks. It's exactly that. It's a night walk. So it's a walk through the forest late at night, connecting with the spirits and our ancestors and ourselves, and facing our fears. Because, everybody seems to be afraid of the dark, and we have to, I don't know, there was going for a walk in the forest at night and addressing the fears that you have about being in the forest at night make a difference to how we are in the world. We get to listen to our heart, we get to listen to the natural environment, because I think, especially people as well, if you're thinking about returning home or leaving the city life, it's really important to reconnect with the natural environment. I remember Astamari telling me about his expedition leadership training, which quite inspired me to go and become an expedition leader. So he is in part to blame for the fact that I take people on night walks through the forest. And it's a beautiful thing to do. And we're going to be going on one soon, aren't we?
Well, I was wondering whether you were able to tell people the date of your next open.
The next one, okay, bless you. The next one will be the 20th, Friday the 20th of March, 2020. We will meet at Lewisham DLR station, 7 p.m. and then we'll take a short bus ride to the local woods. and we'll do a walking meditation where we just slow everything down, and we'll have affirmations, and we'll open ourselves up to each other, and take a walk through. It's really a simple thing that we do, but it has quite a profound effect on people that do it, and they come out and their affirmations are clearer. They have they feel stronger in who they are, and they get answers, because sometimes before we start, if you ask the universe questions, you do the walk, people get answers by the end of the walk. So it's really powerful in that respect.
And let me just say this, that I'm under heavy manners. You know, when the sisters come and they put us under heavy manners, I have to drum. I want to drum as well, of course, but but I have to drum at the night walk. So I'll be making a contribution.
That would be brilliant, because it's the first time we'll be using a drummer, so that would be nice.
Okay, and can we just bring our brother Astamari in, my brother? I'm so sorry for taking up so much of your program, my brother, and I thank you greatly for being so patient and so gracious, in taking the time coming in.
No, give thanks. It's a real, we love it. For the 5 the hard way in the studio. Yeah, man like Supreme in the background, just meditating as he does. Now, you mentioned something about melanin rich. Well, Hashim, everyone, this is Astamari. I'm coming into the next show, Black Open University, but I'm touching base on the mighty Omawali People Show. What a wonderful thing. You mentioned something about melanin rich, and it's connected. It's very profound that you're here. This show that I'm going to do next is going to play mostly from a podcast of Brother Dougie's event, which was Effective Parenting. This was just done, yes. And at that event, some issues came up about people attending, who can come to this, who can not come to that. And your name was mentioned specifically around how the question of who comes to events and your criteria, the melanin rich. So I'm just letting ones know that you're going to hear about the mighty griot and how the principle of melanin rich storytelling works. Because even the ambassadors know the code and defend the code. So listen, stay tuned as we move into the next cycle. This show is still working fine, but you've got a long special edition coming up, and this beautiful Empress will be featured in it through her good works. So it's a pleasure to see you at the Blessed Studio.
Thanks. Oh, give thanks.
Yeah. Hashima, give thanks.
Yeah.
So I'm going to bring this program to a close to clear the path to allow our brother Astamari to come in and just light up the airwaves very shortly. So it really just remains for me to say my thank yous and good nights. So it just remains for me to say thank you to everybody who took time to listen to the program this evening. I want to say thank you to my fellow presenters, especially our brother Astamari, who's coming on very shortly. Thank you to all of the people in the studio who are here interacting with us right now. A big thank you goes out to our engineers who are in the background making things smooth for us. And of course, thank you to our station's management. Thank you for the tremendous work that you do in making sure that this facility is available to our people. But most of all, I want to say thank you to our ancestors, without whom none of us would be here today. My name is Brother Omawale, and I bid you a good evening.